Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kimberly Crenshaw, Executive Director of the African American Policy Forum. Together with the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies, we welcome you to part 9 of our Under the Blacklight series, Narrating the Nightmare and Reimagining the Possible. By this point in the series and in the unfolding tragedy that is COVID-19, we know that when facts don't fit the existing frames, they're lost to history. This was clear long before coronavirus, and we are reminded of it just today as we mourn the death of Breonna Taylor, a Black woman EMT killed in her home because of a ferociously incompetent police raid. On this day, AAPF commemorates the 5th year anniversary of the Say Her Name Vigil for Black women across the country who were killed by police. On this day, we understand with renewed urgency that it's not just the saying of names that does the work. It's the building up of a narrative around those names that allows us to carry forward the work of demanding justice and accountability. The work of social justice is the work of narrative reconstruction, building new stories around facts that are often disregarded, invisibilized, and taken for granted as acceptable and unremarkable features of social life. Over the past 9 weeks, this series has lifted up otherwise overlooked facts and unspoken conditions of COVID-19's disastrous possibilities. We talk to activists, journalists, writers, academics, policy analysts, healers, and sentinels, all to give light to the stories that we were unlikely to see with the dominant frames that shape mainstream news and discourse. For us, it's not just about offering a different set of facts, but activating critical frames from which to engage these margins. From the beginning, we've disrupted early claims that COVID would be the great leveler, offering in its place an intersectional prism to capture the interface between the disease and its pre-existing conditions. We elevated Naomi Klein's generative and devastating analysis of disaster capitalism and came back to it again and again as panelists in subsequent weeks made visible the ways that whiteness has rushed into the cracks created by this moment, deepening its influence and invidious control, making disaster racism fully legible. Through our collective storytelling, we've seen that the horrific unfolding of disaster relief has been built on relief efforts of the past designed not only to reinforce hierarchies, but to stretch their reach into the present. US scholars Ibram Kendi and Carol Anderson and others plotted the course that ultimately activist LaTosha Brown named last week when she welcomed the entire country to Southern rule. Welcome to the South, she said. Under a nationalist White House, Senate, and Justice Department, disaster relief bears precisely the fingerprints of past failures. And outside our borders, Alocha Tudor and Kendi Andrews amplified the hard-dying habits of imperialism's legacy at home and the new islands of confinement for functionally stateless workers, those who occupy the crowded island of being essential but disposable bodies. We've broached the controversial questions head on. Are we seeing a weaponization of COVID-19? Does opening states with knowledge of its fully predictable and devastated effects warrant the use of the G word, genocide? Do tallies and decisions that seem to differ based on where the bodies are impounded suggest such differential assessments of social worth that warrant such an extreme siren? This simply underscores that the struggle at hand is not simply one of survival, but a struggle of interpretation, a struggle over what the story of this moment is and will be for future generations if we are to survive. We know from disasters past that the narrative isn't a flattened caption, but a constitutive act that shapes what is to be done. Take, for example, the ways that suffering was differentially framed by race in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, when two pictures, many of you have seen them displayed on the screen here, of families struggling to survive were framed alternatively as looting versus finding food. This is just a microcosm of the wider historical dynamic. When desperation intersects with Blackness or with other markers of marginality, the caption easily writes itself as looting. When desperation intersects with whiteness or other markers of social power, the situational dimension frames the hero. These interpretations have material legacies that are unfolding everywhere, which is why today we turn to our storytellers, three people who are uniquely situated across genres of fiction and nonfiction to help us interpret the moment. As I prepared for today's panel, I encountered a line from Viet Thanh Nguyen that puts the urgency of today's discussion in sharp relief. He wrote, "All wars are fought twice. The first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. The struggle to tell the subaltern stories is the work of those who take up the pen or the computer to counter the dominant storylines, to repurpose the tools that have collaborated to erase stories of the past narratives, and to see with fresh eyes what needs to be told. They are those who put their gifts in the service of narrative resistance by recording, sharing, and creating. After all, without a story, what are politics? What is survival?" This is why I'm so excited about today's Under the Blacklight. So we've gathered over the last 9 weeks countless shards of reality, and now we can sit at the feet of the master glassblowers to watch and to learn how they see, what they note, and what they capture. We'll hear first from Kiese Layman, who joins us from Oxford, Mississippi. Layman is a professor of English and creative writing at the University of Mississippi and the author of the novel Long Division. His most recent book, Heavy, an American memoir, won the Andrew Carnegie Medal and was named one of the best books of 2018 by countless publications. We'll then turn to Viet Thanh Nguyen in Pasadena, California. Nguyen is professor of American Studies and Ethnicity and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California. His best-selling book, The Sympathizer, won the 2016 Pulitzer Prize in Fiction, and he's published 4 other critically acclaimed texts. Finally, we'll hear from Arundhati Roy in Delhi, India. Roy is the author of the 1997 Man Booker Prize winning The God of Small Things. She has written numerous works of critically acclaimed nonfiction and is the recipient of countless awards. You can find each panelist's extraordinary bio on our website, www.aapf.org. As always, throughout this social justice SOS event, we want to hear from you. So please comment on our discussion in the Zoom chat or comment on YouTube if you're watching the live stream. Share the conversation across social media by following me and AAPF on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, using the hashtag Under the Blacklight. We'll be sharing comments, questions with our panelists throughout the event, and we'll be inviting a few guests with questions to our after the show talkback over Zoom. So let's dive in with Kiese Layman. So Kiese, in response to your exquisite memoir, Heavy, Time magazine wrote, "How do you love authentically when lies feel so familiar?" And this question has been ringing in my head since I read it and then thought about it again in the midst of COVID. How do we live to adapt the question authentically in crisis when lies feel so familiar? So what are the lies America is telling itself today, and how are they shaping the story of this pandemic?
Thank you for having me, first of all. That's a big question, Kim. I guess I just want to start by saying that one of the lies I wanted to tell myself when the pandemic sort of hit was that there's a beginning to this particular virus and that there'll be an end to it. Every morning I wake up, I ask myself what I want to lie about. That list is often usually long. And I think thinking and listening and talking to people just helped me come to the realization that, you know, I am from Mississippi. our unpaid essential labor created the American economy. And so this moment is crucial, but it's equally crucial for me that we remember that essential unpaid workers in Mississippi and their descendants were not valued as essential workers, even human beings with interiorities worthy of like essential protection, not just from Trump, but by Washington, from Lincoln, from Roosevelt, from Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and Obama. So like when a pandemic hits a country as willfully neglected and neglecting as ours, a country run by whom the worst of white folk deem presidential, I think it's easy to call that suffering sanctity and eventually to call that destruction dawn. And when you do that, I think you get what we have now. What we have now is a continued suffering of essential and expendable human beings. Most of whom in my state are Black women. And we also get a country longing to get back to like this manufactured celebration, which always come at the expense of humiliated, expendable workers. So I just think I need to say that first because I couldn't get to that for the first 2 or 3 months of this pandemic. We take care of my grandmother. My grandmother was born and raised in Forest in Scott County, Mississippi. She worked in those Mississippi fields, unpaid. She eventually worked as a domestic in the homes of wealthy white people. And then she was quote unquote lucky enough to get picked to work the line at a chicken plant. That was a big deal. 1, because she was a Black woman. 2, because she was a Black woman. And what the poultry industry really realized is that they could pay Black women less for more and better work. And so every day she went to work in the morning, she got up at 4:30 in the morning, she left the house, she didn't have a glove, she didn't have a mask, all she wore was a hairnet because the white folk who ran the plant didn't want her kind of hair falling into their chicken, their product. You know, my grandma was 91 now, we had to move her up from Scott County, where she spent most of her life working in chicken plants because of like these massive COVID outbreaks that were happening in the plant. And if people remember a year ago in August, ICE raided the plants in Scott County. One of the plants they raided was a plant where my grandmother used to work. And during that raid, no one seemed to care at all about the children of the people who were being arrested. And nobody at all talked about the conditions of that plant. So what I need to do is ask myself what it meant for my grandmama to walk out of white people's home and choose to work in a place where she had to stand up for 8 hours a day, cutting the bellies open of chickens with no mask. A place where she could never be granted managerial status, or definitely she couldn't run the place at all. And what it means also for our Latinx brothers and sisters and genderqueer folk who are literally our neighbors, they literally live next door to us, to have their children taken and have everybody in the world talk about the raids, but not talk about the conditions in which they were living. So there's a lot to talk about in this pandemic, but I believe that humiliation is like the primary dish being served. And my belief is that like death is kind of like a side of humiliation and the inevitable outcome of systemic humiliation. And so like the economic and the political and really global dimensions of this humiliation and the necessity of sustainable pushback and really like communal pleasure making are some things that I hope we can talk about today.
Yes, you know, thank you for that, Kiese. And as you are always want to do, you introduce dimensions beyond what we initially see. So the many ways in which you've written about your grandmother's life lived in that paradox between being essential and expendable. And then you go beyond that to the embodiment of this paradox, sometimes even within our communities and our families, which is, you know, sort of beyond boundaries that many people will go, looking at interior dimensions of power, whether it's racial power, gender power, intra-communal, familial, as well as intercommunal. And one of the things that you just mentioned, I want you to say a little bit more about, you've looked at the emerging patterns of who wears a mask and who does not. What goes on in the eyes of the mask wearers that you see, that you want to draw attention to, that deepens this tragedy, and what goes on in the eyes of the non-mask wearers.
Right. And I think Kim, that's where it gets tricky for me, because when my grandmama was brought up from Scott County to Jackson, which is a capital of my city, and then when I came back up to Oxford, Oxford is one of these cities that is seen or deemed as particularly liberal in Mississippi. But when the governor gave the open order, I mean, I drive downtown and you see all of these essential Black workers either working as cooks, as waiters, as bouncers, and all of them had on masks, right? And there were masses of white folks trying to get into these bars and these restaurants. And when I drove around the square, none of them had on masks. And I just want us to put the politics of humiliation at the center and ask ourselves, like, what does that mean? And ask ourselves what it would mean for a country to essentially pay essential workers. You know what I'm saying? How do we make essential workers, the health of essential workers, the economic vitality of essential workers, like essential? And in the absence of that, I just think we have to talk about what I feel like is an intentional desire to kill, yes, but to humiliate. And so that is where my cousins and my uncles and my aunties and my grandmother and my mother are living now, right? Like, how do you go to work every day knowing that part of your job means you have to protect, these various patrons from a disease that they aren't doing anything to protect you from? I think that's the question of Black Americans in this country. And I think it's a particular question of Black women in my state, most of whom are the essential workers.
So profound. And I want to come back shortly to the double-edged sword of humiliation as well, because as we know, one of the justifications that now circulates around the demands, the armed demands of reopening the state is, the humiliation of not being allowed to work, not having freedom. So, humiliation circulates in ways that are sometimes really difficult to consistently locate and politicize towards progressive purposes. But thank you for putting humiliation in, because that's the thing that you're not gonna hear a conversation about the humiliation dimension on mainstream television. That's not the part of the story that is being told. So with respect to parts of the story that are being told in particularly specious ways or problematic ways, I guess, I'm going to turn to you, Viet, to talk about sort of the double-edged dimension of the demand for the data. So for the first, several weeks, there was, sort of no data that tracked what many of us knew we were seeing. It was sort of like the myth that it's hitting us all the same was sort of a dominant frame. And then data did start to come forward, and people are trying to use data to magnify the significance of what the threat is. Yet in grappling, sort of with how to think about that, some of the frames import their own narratives of who counts and who doesn't. And I wonder what you have been seeing with regard to how the data, the metrics that the data are being used to sort of tell Americans how significant this moment is.
Well, another way of measure, first of all, thank you for having me on this fabulous broadcast, Kimberly. And, one of the ways that we've been measuring time now has been through this count of death. And every week we start to see the death toll rising for Americans. A few weeks ago, it was 58,000 or so dead Americans. Now it's about 92,000 or so dead Americans. And when I see this kind of death count, one of the things I'm reminded of course, is the body count from the Vietnam War, when you would tune in every night and see how many Americans have died fighting in the Vietnam War. And this point was already brought home because one of the ways by which we've been talking about the American death count has been comparing it to the deaths of Americans in the various wars, or the many, many wars that Americans have fought. And so when we reached the 58,000 death count, for example, the milestone there was, well, that was how many Americans died during the Vietnam War. And isn't that horrible and tragic? Which it certainly is. But I came from Vietnam as a refugee from the Vietnam War, and I can't help but think that the death count is a metric or a statistic that can also shadow our reality in different ways. So I think of 58,000 dead Americans. I also think about the 3 million or so Vietnamese who died during the Vietnam War, and the 3 million or so Laotians and Cambodians who died during the years of the war and afterwards. And I have a suspicion that most Americans have no idea how many Vietnamese people died during the Vietnam War, and probably have no idea that the war was fought in Laos and Cambodia. And so what this tells me is that Americans have a particular relationship to death that is quite American-centric, which is normal, but it's also related to our attitudes about who we are as Americans, our notions of American exceptionalism, our notions of American individualism that are completely tied up with our response to COVID-19. Now, one way to think about this is that people around the world admire Americans for their rugged individualism and for their exceptionalism. And of course, if we look at American history, rugged individualism is another code word for American conquest, westward expansion, settler colonization, genocide, slavery. All these things are part of America as well. But most of the rest of the world, or much of the rest of the world, has been willing to overlook these other aspects of American society and favor and praise American individualism. Well, this American individualism is precisely one of the reasons why we can't contain the death count at the moment, because Americans can't restrain themselves and act collectively in our own interest. And this has two implications, I think. One, of course, is our utter disregard for the death count or how this COVID is impacting the rest of the world. I think we have a very poor sense of how the rest of the world has been dealing with and has been suffering from COVID. And the other thing about the death count is, as you said, it has now started to illuminate the differential ways by which death affects Americans. So at the point when we thought COVID would kill everybody, we were all in this together. Now, as the statistics are showing that more Black and brown people, Native people, Pacific Islanders are suffering disproportionately from this, as Chiesa has also pointed out, there's been much less regard for the importance of the death count for Americans. Now the death burden is being unequally shared, as it always has been in American history. So COVID, again, is revealing the systemic ways by which this disease can't be separated from everything else that makes us Americans, that is part of this so-called American exceptionalism. And so we have to confront this, I think. Now that we have seen these kinds of statistics coming out, we need to acknowledge the ways in which COVID is a social and a political disease that needs to be confronted as much as it is an epidemiological matter as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you wrote about ideas that won't survive the virus, or at least things that we hope won't survive the virus. And one is, as you just mentioned, what we are admired for is this rugged individualism, and the negative and naked underbelly of that is frequently, not seen. I'm wondering whether in literary, conversation, there's a similar kind of reckoning with the fact that although it's laid bare, the laying of its bareness may in fact just prompt another sort of narrative confrontation with the fact that, as you started, some bodies really just don't matter. So even though we now see the naked underbelly of Americans' individualism, we see, as you've mentioned earlier, that some part of the America is a super spreader of this disease. Does that create a moment of self-reflection, or a moment of doubling down on some of the most negative dimensions of our self-regard as the center of the universe? So I'm wondering of the strains that you are seeing, either this is the great reckoning, which a lot of progressives thought this was going to be with respect to healthcare, for example, or this is more likely a moment that, at least without a whole lot of work, is just going to reproduce the same kind of exceptionalist, we are special, we have a right, to do whatever we want to do, that has been part of the American legacy for so long.
This country is built on contradictions. And of course, the most basic contradiction is between our ideals of freedom and liberty and so on, and the fact that the country was built on genocide and slavery and expansion and colonization. These are facts. I don't think these facts are in dispute, but as you're implying, how we interpret these facts and tell stories about them is absolutely critical to how we understand ourselves. And now more than possibly at any other moment in American history, for quite a while, we're recognizing that this is a country of two different kinds of stories. So yes, progressives, liberals, radicals, Democrats, and so on are telling a story about a crisis in American exceptionalism. And at the most extreme, not just a crisis in American exceptionalism, but the end of the American empire. On the other side, of course, people are telling a completely different story, that we can overcome this as we have supposedly overcome other kinds of challenges in the past through our rugged individualism. This is a real danger. I think that obviously for most of the people on this panel, we're all professional storytellers, writers, and so on. We have a different relationship to the stories that we tell, possibly, than the people who are invested in rugged American individualism and make America great again. So what I think about this is that storytelling is built on empathy. It's one of its most basic elements. But empathy is deeply politicized, has always been deeply politicized. We're not naturally empathetic to everybody. We're empathetic in ways that are culturally ingrained, politically ingrained. We learn how to see and to recognize different kinds of people. And that is something that, historically in this country has been a really difficult issue. Who do we recognize? Who do we see? What kind of stories do we tell? And unfortunately, the outcome, I think, is that for those of us who feel that we are marginalized, exploited, unseen, rendered invisible, humiliated in American society, no one else can tell our stories but us. This is why the act of storytelling and narrative is so crucial. This is why we depend on our storytellers to be a part of this struggle to get our stories out there. And probably the last thing I'll say about this is that in the end, we are all storytellers. We replicate, we reproduce stories in conversations we have over the dining table, in conversations we have with our colleagues. It's on us to recognize these narratives, to contest them. We all have the possibility of at least engaging with the people around us and our stories there.
Thank you, Viet. Arundhati, Viet just mentioned the Make America Great Again. So I wanna bring you in on the, I guess the interesting convergences between India and the US in the pre-existing condition that shapes this moment. Each country, of course, is going to have to deal with its own pre-existing condition that shapes the trajectory of COVID, both in terms of the disease itself and the social disorders that it takes advantage of. But there seems to be actually a sort of special convergence, if you will, between India and the United States that might help us create a caption under the pictures of Modi and Trump in front of throngs of Indians and Americans in both countries. And some part of it may take up the fact that this disease elevates dimensions of the embodied histories of social hierarchy in both of our countries, around a logic of others being diseased as carriers of filth, as segregation and separation, as in the service of public health, in the service of individual health, spiritual health. It sort of naturalizes through the disease all these pre-existing ways in which social hierarchy in these countries, have been rationalized. And of course, violence is never too far behind. So if Modi and Trump and his supporters sort of see, common storylines with each other, What's that telling us that we need to be seeing as, sort of the non-participants in the throngs that come out to see the two of them together?
Thanks, Kim, for having me here. I'm getting such a lovely view into what people who don't live in America don't get told, actually. So, I spent so much of my time and writing contesting these terms like America and India and China, because what do they mean eventually? When someone asks me, tell us about women in India, and I'm always like, which woman, India is such as is America. When people, most people in India would look at these numbers or figures that are coming out of America and think of America as the nation of white people, and not think of the fact that there is this hierarchy which so reflects a kind of hierarchy here. So, how can I even begin to explain this? But this illness, COVID, is creating a class which is going to be separated from another class, the working class, whose bodies will now be seen as a biohazard, and that have to be hermetically sealed off from each other, where touch is toxic. And this, in India, is a society that has practiced for centuries untouchability. It invented untouchability. It created human beings that other human beings said were untouchable, were polluted. It has a hierarchy of purity and pollution, much more complex in terms of its divisions than race. And the difference being that it's divine, it's supposedly divinely sanctioned. So you're playing out, something of the sins of your past. But what you ask, what COVID has done, just in the way that it enters the human body and amplifies previous illnesses and infirmities, what it has done to people in America, obviously, the reason that it's more rampant among African American communities and Native American is because obviously they have not had medical attention for as long as they've existed, because in America, medicine and medical attention is only for a particular class, a protected class. So it has entered these bodies that have been made vulnerable by the system and devastated them. In the same way, it enters societies and exposes their inequalities and infirmities. In India, the crisis is, I hardly can, I'm rarely like this, but I can hardly tell you and speak about the scale at which it's happening. And it's not only because of the illness of COVID, which has not, well, one doesn't know how much you can trust data, but whatever data we have says that, they made landfall in the US and in India around the same time, but in India so far, 3,000 people have died. But when there were 500 cases or 540 cases and 10 deaths, Modi announced a lockdown. 4 hours notice, 1.38 billion people were locked down. And the next day, you found millions of people stranded in cities with no food, no water, no shelter, no protection. And they began to walk like hundreds of miles home to the villages they had come from. But the thing is that they were people who have been erased from the imagination of this country, erased from literature, erased from poetry, erased from cinema. Recently, there was not, before the 90s, the poor in India were very much part of storytelling. But when India became aligned with the free market and with capitalism and aspirational, we had to now pretend that this huge mass of people didn't exist and doesn't exist. And on the day of the lockdown, the day after the lockdown, suddenly they made themselves visible, like a chemical experiment, this exodus began 55 days ago, and it's still on. It's still on. But you have people being beaten by the police. Then they started walking on the railway tracks. They are beaten on the railway tracks. They have got run over. Hundreds of people have been killed. They are still walking. They are being held in these camps. There are visuals of people being held like animals and sprayed with bleach, by the police. And then you had so we have a crisis of health beyond COVID, a crisis of hunger, a crisis of hatred, which is another story. These are all parallel stories. And when we talk about workers and frontline workers being disposable, this has been the case always, isn't it? I mean, the wars that America has fought, as Viet says, 3 million people died in Vietnam. Look at what happened in the Iraq war, where first you had sanctions, where people were not allowed to get medicine when they were ill. 1 million people died, according to the UN. And Madeleine Albright said, it's a hard price, but we think it's worth it. Just from the sanctions, forget about the war, And all the workers who are feeding the American way of life, the people who work in mines, the people they've all frontline workers whose lungs turn to stone from the dust that comes from the mines. And this is not just American capitalism now, Indian capitalism too. I've been to villages where, in every village you have a person whose lungs have literally turned to stone, sitting there and rocking, because that's how you recognize fluorosis, In the time when 3,000 people have died of COVID, 150,000 people have died of another infectious respiratory disease known as tuberculosis, which has now been made into a poor person's disease, and therefore it doesn't matter. It just carries on as a background score. If you had the same kind of television reporting about tuberculosis as you have about COVID, the number of people dying is huge. Every year, 1 million children under 5 in India die of diarrhea, So you have now a situation where capitalism has created these inequalities. Now COVID has amplified them, and you have authoritarian figures like Trump and Modi who are similar and very different. I mean, Trump is like, to me, a kind of a factory waste that arrived and is contested by the media. Even the elite media in the US, is constantly criticizing him. Whereas Modi is a product of a fascist cultural guild that was set up in 1925 that called Muslims the Jews of Germany. Muslims of India are like the Jews of Germany. So that organization, which has, when he was chief minister in a state called Gujarat, there was a massacre of 2,500 Muslims slaughtered on the streets in cities and so on. It only increased his popularity, And now he is the prime minister. And just today, I was looking at the fact that a politician of his party was talking to people and saying that, the Muslims, they are the spreaders of this disease. You must make sure that there aren't any Muslims in your neighborhood. This is a jihad that they are doing on us. And Muslims are being lynched. You have television channels with hashtag Corona Jihad or hashtag human bomb, calling them super spreaders, very much in the way that Jews were accused of spreading typhus by the Nazis. I was looking at a a man was brutally beaten up by the police, a man with a beard who was going to hospital because he had severe diabetes. And then he turned out not to be a Muslim. He was a Hindu with a beard. And the police said, sorry, we thought you were a Muslim. This is their explanation.
Wow.
Beating them,
Yeah.
So you
there's
know,
there's so much to hold up that's in common, you know, between the two. And you know, when we look at these convergences, we try to, you know, we just basically have about a minute before break. What is it, Arundhati, that telling the stories is meant to activate? What is it, as you look and scan and lift these up, what is the power of the story that you're marshaling?
Hi there, Kim. So it looks like we've lost connection with Arundhati, but she'll be back momentarily. But this might be a great time to check in and see what's going on in the chat room. Great. So I just want to say thank you so much to everybody who's listening online. We have people tuning in from a number of different platforms, which is incredible. And there's so many words of appreciation for this space, for all the incredible panelists who are sharing their perspective and reframing the conversation. And also thank you to everyone who's joining in from all around the world. We have people listening in from Alabama and Stockholm, Brussels, numerous regions of India, from Baton Rouge, from the Philippines, from Nigeria. So just thank you so much all for being here. And the conversation that's going on in the chat room is pretty incredible. People are talking about things that feel unique to America, but also thinking about the echoes of expendability around the world. People are talking about migrant workers in India, the Chinese immigrants who've worked on the Transcontinental Railroad, frontline nurses from the Philippines who are working around the world. So the conversation that you all are having is really resonating with people in a lot of different ways. And just lastly, people are really starting to think about what is our relationship to the truth in narratives, and how does that play out in our relationship to leadership, in our relationship to medicine and data. So it's a great conversation going on online, and we'll look forward to checking in with you a little later.
Thanks so much, Awoye. So we're having just a tad bit of technical difficulties, but the conversation is so rich. I think we're certainly able to sit through a few little glitches, but we're going to continue. So Kiese, I want to come back to you to pick up that conversation that we started to have about humiliation. So one way, I guess, of thinking about why we see gun-toting, you know, militia people assaulting sort of dominant sensibilities about lawmaking in a time of crises is in some way the mobilization of humiliation. We don't want to be humiliated. We don't want to be treated as though we're subjects of the mammy state. I'm using that intentionally, an adaptation of the nanny state. There is also a broader historical narrative that, so much of what has caused, worldwide discord is responses to humiliation, either felt humiliation or, actual intention to humiliate. So I guess part of the challenge of distinguishing various modalities of humiliation is in the story. So how as a storyteller yourself, do you shift to talk about the humiliation that you identified earlier, particularly the humiliation of Black women, being forced to serve people and protect them in ways that they're not protected, and the projected humiliation of the gun toters in the Capitol? What are the ways that storytelling helps to distinguish between those?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a great question, Kim. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah. So
thankfully.
So for me, I think I always need to deal with what's easy and what's hard. And what's easy for me is, and what's been easy for me for the last 3 months, shamefully, is that I've wanted these people and the people who created Trump, which are the people and the sensibilities that also created the arena that my grandmother could really work unpaid labor in. I've wanted them to suffer, and I've wanted to humiliate them much more than I've wanted me and my family and our folks to be free. And so I need to confront that as an artist, right? Like why in this moment, and in several other moments in my life, have I wanted these people to suffer and be humiliated much more than I want to be free? And I think to answer that question, it's more than implication, it's more than confession. It's about truthfully like winding your way into the ways you humiliate, not just in interpersonal relationships, but in transactional relationships with capital. And so like when I started to think a lot about those gun-toting dudes who were trying to, mostly men who were trying to, I don't know what the fuck they were actually like wanting to get free of. I can't actually get into white folks' minds that way. But I thought about the way March 10th, right on the cusp of when people think the pandemic broke out in America, I was paid to get on a plane and go to Cincinnati and then ultimately go to West Virginia and go to New York. I knew I should not have gotten on that plane. One, because I helped take care of someone who was immunely compromised. Two, because I'm a big Black boy. And most importantly, which was 3 or 4, because there were tons of essential workers in that airport, the people who drove me to the airport, the folks who worked on that airplane, the people who had to clean the building that I gave a reading at, who were going to be more exposed to this virus had I not done it. But because I am the progeny of people who were unpaid labor, their humiliation didn't matter, right? The fact that I was like aiding in a humiliation, not just like, giving people COVID or potentially creating spaces where people could get COVID, like I was aiding in the humiliation of essential workers so I could get a paycheck to help take care of myself, but also take care of someone who has been essentially underpaid her entire life. And so as writers, we have to get in there and we have to take the tools that the social scientists have given us. But I just feel like we can't, much more important than losing the eye of our experiences, we can't lose the body, like the bodily experience of getting in that car, knowing you shouldn't be getting in that car, getting on that airplane, knowing you shouldn't be getting on that airplane, opening up that check, wondering, should you feel joy and or sadness? What do you do with this check? And I just feel like artists, and I feel like we're all artists to a certain extent, are like perfectly situated to slow those moments down and sort of move away from this easy, Trump and them are fucked up. Hell yeah, Trump and them are fucked up. Hell yeah, they seem like sons and nephews and nieces of the devil to me. But the sad thing is like some of that fuck shit they got in them, I know I have in me. And I've humiliated folk interpersonally, and I perpetually humiliate people in these economic transactions. So I can't write like a brief about that. I can't write an analysis about that, but I can create artful journeys that explore and implicate and move. And I think that's what a lot of storytellers can do in this moment right now.
Yeah. And when I think about that, Kiese, and bring it into conversation with, some of the armchair theorization that we on progressive, in progressive circles have generated for, decades. The idea that, when the hammer hits us all, that will be the moment where, the great awakening happens. I mean, that's sort of the top line. And I do think, your honesty in being able to say, well, behind some of that was, y'all gonna get it too someday. And there is sort of a, it's coming now, so it does open up for us some dimensions of what we hold to be kind of the politics of, everybody is in this at some point, actually a desire for others to experience some of what they've made us experience. So I think that's important to be able, especially for writers, to be able to force us to look at. You also mentioned other things that, sort of caused you to step back a moment. And I wondered if you could talk just a little bit about how you heard some of your students talk about, what this moment portended, the celebratory dimension of it, also as an act supposedly of some kind of solidarity, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think for better and a whole lot of worse, like the white liberal or good white folk have been situated throughout American storytelling as the center, actually, of American storytelling. And also think young people should be allowed to be ignorant. I think the whole point of school is like, allow yourself to be ignorant so you can throw out some ignorant ideas and they can come back remixed and revised. But before before people thought that this country was like in the throes of like the COVID-19 pandemic, I had several students who happened to be white and would identify as liberal and or radical, saying, this is great. I think this is going to take out all the old white people. I can't wait. Like saying it, not whispering it, like saying it in class. And so, Flannery O'Connor, Faulkner, all these other writers have, again, for better or worse, put that kind of liberal sensibility on the table and talked to us about how it needs to be chopped up. But I just think it's very interesting to me, coming from Mississippi, a place where white folk will reach through their own chest, to snatch the heart out of Black, Indigenous, brown folks. That's how my state is born, right? And so it's often interesting to me. It was interesting in those classrooms to hear students who are brilliant think they were performing some sort of like revolutionary gesture to say that they hope ultimately that the white folk who are responsible for what they think is the evil of this country died. And as a writer, what do you do with that? Do you know what I'm saying? Because when I sit down to write about that, it's not what I'm doing now. I can't just say it. Like there's some dimension to that, right? But I wonder how we talk about the dimensions of that without centering this like white sort of neoliberal, ultra liberal, questionably radical self that often gets centered a lot in our literature, because I'm not interested in doing that. But how do we talk about that and not center it is something that I'm really trying to think about with my new projects.
And Viet, you also had a moment of, I guess, encounter and surprise about the impact of COVID, sort of the generational dimensions of it. How are you thinking about that and potentially incorporating it into the stories that you want to try to tell, either through fiction or nonfiction?
Well, I think one of the most surprising aspects of all of this is the fact that, initially we thought that COVID would really disproportionately impact the elderly, which it has. And the collective American response to that, or at least a significant part of American society, has been to shrug their shoulders and to say, well, that's too bad. They were going to die anyway. And, the implication, of course, is also that they're no longer useful to capitalism. And I think, maybe this has changed the perceptions of a lot of elderly people who've been invested in the American system and the investment in the idea that America is about supporting life, when to a large extent, America has also been about exploiting people until they're dead. So we're undergoing a shock to the system for so many of us, ourselves individually, ourselves as parts of certain groups, and ourselves as part of a country in relationship to the entire world, where we see the callousness of the system that we live in and our connections to other people. And so I think this is really crucial. I mean, one of the challenges that we're faced with is, are we going to retreat back into ourselves, into our own clusters, into our own communities, or are we going to recognize the solidarities that bind us, either the solidarities of humanity or the other kind of connection of exploitation? And I think for writers, that's a challenge we also have to recognize. And a lot of the storytelling that takes place in American letters is oftentimes extremely individualistic, extremely isolated. So there could be a really real possibility that COVID era literature will be about people, trying to get away from this in the Hamptons. And there'll be another kind of COVID era literature that will be exactly about trying to point out what our connections happen to be. And again, writers from communities of color, writers from marginalized communities have always been trying to do that. It's one of the crucial marks of our kind of storytelling, is to try to stress how we're connected to each other. And I'll just end with a note about my own particular community, Asian Americans. We've witnessed a rise in anti-Asian racism in various ways, describing this as the Chinese virus, for example, justifying rising incidents of anti-Asian racism. And what this has proven for Asian Americans is that for many people who have thought that they were welcomed into American society as the model minority, they realize, well, we've always occupied a very ambiguous place in American society, in which some of us have thought that we've had privilege. And now in this era, the anti-Asian racism has demonstrated that we, along with many other populations, are very easily disposed of as well. So what do we do with that? Do we simply try to defend ourselves? Or do we try to recognize that our plight is connected to the plights of so many other peoples in this country as well? So Asian Americans also face this challenge of either retreating into themselves and defending themselves, or trying to connect their stories to stories of others in American society.
Yeah. And we had the occasion, we had a black Under the Blacklight right after the sort of infamous op-ed that was written by our former nominee, hopeful for the Democratic Party, to basically say the answer to the anti-Asian violence is to perform Americanness, to try to assimilate as much as possible. And as we talked about it, Mari Matsuda, who was our guest, pointed out that this is an example of failed storytelling. This is an example of so little presence, the absence of plenitude that tells the long-standing story of Asian presence here, and also tells the story of the always contingent dimension of otherness, that one can perform American and one can be contingently seen as such, but moments of crises like this, you sort of defy the ability to perform your way out of it. So when you see these moments like that, like we have to perform, X, Y, and Z, does it raise for you, more of the urgency of what stories need to be told, or more of the limitation of what storytelling can do in politically charged moments like these? And I would imagine it's both and. So how you think about that is what I'm really interested in.
So the structural place of Asian Americans in American society is that we're supposed to be in the middle, we're supposed to be the model, and we're supposed to be docile and compliant. And part of what goes along with that in terms of storytelling is that we're expected to perform gratitude for what we have and to apologize for our place in American society. Storytelling here is really crucial, because as a storyteller, my stance has been, don't apologize and don't be grateful. So for example, I'm here as a refugee from the Vietnam War, and a lot of Vietnamese refugees feel grateful to the United States for rescuing them. Well, that may be true, but we wouldn't need to be rescued unless we'd been bombed by the United States in the first place. And you have to be able to say these kinds of things. You have to refuse apology. You have to refuse docility. It's a crucial aspect of what makes a great storyteller a great storyteller. No one ever became a great storyteller by apologizing and by trying to perform docility. You have to be assertive. You have to recognize your place in American society. So Asian Americans don't have to apologize or to beg for Americanness. We are Americans by dint of being here and by dint of everything that, multiple generations have done. But, one of the things that Asian Americans have always tried to do is to say that we need to claim America, to assert our Americanness against being seen as perpetual foreigners. Now that's important, but what does it mean to claim America? Yet when we claim America, we have to claim all of it, all of the United States of America, which means not just a democracy and the liberty and the American exceptionalism and the capitalism and all those supposedly good things. We have to claim the entire history of conquest and genocide and slavery and that we benefit from, that immigrants benefit from in coming to this country. And that's a kind of complexity that a lot of Asian Americans don't want to recognize, but which we have to, and that's a crucial function of the storytelling that we can perform. We can tell stories that are about becoming Americans, or we can tell stories about becoming Americans and all the complexity that entails, including participating in American power and how it's wielded domestically and how it's wielded, in terms of our wars overseas as well.
So helpful. So one dimension of how narrative, how stories, function as witnessing, I think, is something that Arundhati Roy's really, perfected. And I think the essay that many people, I'm sure, on this phone call have read, the use of the portal to think and write about this moment, had in its core, the story of accompaniment, right? A writer accompanying the story, the subjects, witnessing, being part of the dimension of the story that is not being carried and covered. So many of our eyes were open, Arundhati, when you talked about walking with migrant workers in the same way that earlier we learned about the impact of a reckless development on people. Yet in this moment, the capacity, the possibility of that accompaniment is exactly what is less realizable. So how do we think about this? Is this a moment where, as they say, necessity is the mother of invention? So as storytellers who have engaged in the process of accompaniment, do you have to come up with a way of doing that work through the modalities that we have, like what we're doing now? This would have been unimaginable 6 months ago, that I could have gotten the three of you in the same room at the same time without like 2 years planning, right? So this has invented and created new possibilities. Are we seeing this in terms of what you think is possible to do? Or are you despairing of now what it means that we've lost, touch, for example, as Kiese mentioned, and Eve Ensler has been talking about it. How are we thinking about this, for the foreseeable future, mediated connection, both in our bodies and in our politics?
Well, I think, when I use the word portal, I used it as a metaphor for a connection between two worlds, but also to underline the fact that there is a rupture and that we cannot think. Right now, we are in some kind of a transit lounge, and we can't really, we don't really have a present. It's almost like there's a past and there's a future, and somehow, how do we stitch this together? We have to think about how we move in, and the people that are in power, the mandarins that are controlling the language of this moment, are moving their chessmen very, very quickly. So so we have seen that. The kind of marriage between the disaster capitalists and the nationalist, chauvinist, authoritarian governments. So when I was listening to you talking, I was pretty it made me thoughtful about the way you all talk about being American and claiming America's past or America's problems. Whereas here, it's become so terrifying, the idea of what is Indian, who is Indian. Muslims are traitors, non-Hindus are not really Indians. So the idea of thinking in these administrative country borders, sort of terrifies me, because, the greatest enemy of India is Pakistan. But, 70 years ago, Pakistan and India were one country. So when you start thinking about countries, and COVID has made us emphasize and contain our thoughts within national borders, while capitalism has made this a world of refugees. Everyone is a refugee. When people keep talking about migrant labor, actually they are refugees. If you think of refugees not just from one country to another, but from one region to another, they are internal refugees who have been pushed out of their homes and their lands by huge infrastructure projects when India decided to join the free market and forget about the fact that we're a poor country, but yay, we have 63 billionaires, And now these tech giants are here. So you have Facebook has shook hands with a big mobile phone company here, and therefore given them access to 400 million WhatsApp users. You have the whole preparation for a surveillance state, and we are all being forced to download this particular app, which hasn't even been vetted. It isn't even legal that you can force people to do it. Right, this man on the screen, the man who owns India, as they say, Mr. Ambani. So it's a moment where while we are incarcerated, but talking to each other like this and imagining what we can do, they are moving very, very fast. So while human beings are looking in awe at nature sort of regenerating in some way, in India, for example, they've already signed off a elephant sanctuary to become a coal mine, building of big dams, of everything that has created this injustice. More of it is going to happen pretending to address the injustice and expand and continue to create these huge divisions that exist, to deepen them. And that is terrifying. And eventually we can't deal with it by going on a Twitter storm. That's not going to happen. Like, eventually we will have to be out there on the front lines along with the frontline workers. We will, because what is being planned is a kind of dystopia that doesn't bear thinking about. But how do we have like, I was talking to Naomi actually yesterday, and I was saying that in the 60s we had radical revolutionary movements demanding justice, demanding the redistribution of wealth, demanding land to the tiller. And now we're just like in our homes saying, can we come out? And what are we even asking for? We've become people who are just discussing human rights. We've forgotten the grand idea of justice. And democracy has come to mean just elections. So all of us will put our energy into campaigning for whoever it is that is opposing Modi or opposing Trump, and then they'll betray us, which is fine. I mean, to me, you vote for the enemy that you want to have, not for the leader that you love. But still, democracy, every institution in the US has been undermined. The courts have gone, so here you have media that is just amplifying this hatred 24 hours a day, every day, mainstream media. And when we imagine another world, of course you have to first imagine it before you fight for it. And of course that is the business of of writers, and that is what one has been doing for so long, but what is that imagination? Yesterday I was saying that that imagination involves looking at a mountain with minerals in it and saying, can we leave the minerals in the mountain? Can we leave the bauxite in the mountain?
Right.
Or because that bauxite in the mountain serves a purpose. It works as a water tank. It's a porous rock. Bauxite is what you use to make aluminum, which is being just mined. But in nature, bauxite is a water tank. It holds water and it irrigates the plains. To the people who live there, it means everything. But to the capitalist world, it only means anything when it's extracted.
Yes.
And when function in nature is destroyed. So the imagination is, can you leave the bauxite in the mountain as you walk through the portal? Can you understand that this way of life, known as the American way of life, eventually it's even going to destroy the racists and the guys with guns and everybody. It's going to destroy them all, of course. And
well, thank you, Arundhati. So much has been put in the mix, and we want to move to our roundtable. But before we do, I want to check back in with the conversation online and listen to a few of the questions for our panelists from the audience. So back to you, Owoye.
Thank you so much, Kim. The conversation continues in a very vibrant fashion online. And people are both appreciating the conversation and thinking individually about how to use stories to explore the contradictions inside of ourselves. And people are also thinking about what are the tools and the frames that we should be thinking about to accept the truths of the past in order to create a new narrative for the future. So there's some great, big, bold questions going on online. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Owoye. So I'm going to turn these over to our panelists. This is for some quick responses, a minute or so are left. We have about 15 minutes left in this fascinating conversation. And I'm going to get the ball rolling and throw one to you, Viet. I'm really interested in the ways that COVID will appear in the storytelling of the future, and whether this moment actually, I don't know how to put this, like sort of shifts the baseline about what counts as what. So we're living in a moment where absurdity and horror are the new normal. So when the reality, it just redefines absurdity and horror as just what is, does it empty the category of what writing looks like that fills that category? One way of thinking, is there any coming back from this? Is there any return? So especially with your fiction writer's hat on, how are you thinking about how these moments sort of reboot the baselines for what even counts as absurdity or horror?
I think, human beings have an infinite capacity for absurdity and horror. So, I mean, we're living under a very unique moment, which it's kind of like a war, because when a war happens, let me rephrase that. It's kind of like World War II. When that war happened, everybody was involved. It's not true that when wars happen, everyone's involved. And we've been living through a forever war for 20 years, and most of the American population is not involved, even though it does actually involve all of American society. So this is a very different kind of crisis, because there's no place in this country where you can go that's not touched, and there's nobody who's not touched in some way by what's taking place. So I think that it's going to have a definite impact on our stories. But like I said, it's unpredictable, the kind of stories we're going to get. We're going to get the, I'm stuck in my New York studio apartment kind of story, and I'm worried about packages being delivered to my door. And we're going to get the kinds of stories about humiliation that Kiese has been talking about. And of course, I favor the latter kind of stories, the ones that bring out the deep tragedy and the interrelated kinds of humiliations and exploitations that bind us together as Americans. But I also, as someone who has written satirical fiction, think that nothing is beyond our capacity to satirize, as long as we're not dead. If we survive this, there is the, with the passage of time, the possibility of seeing how what's being exposed in American society is not just a tragedy, but the absurdity of living in a country that is supposedly a capitalist American dream for all, that is beyond the reach of so many people in this country, and that we're being ruled by buffoons. So that is also American exceptionalism as well, that, our history of American exceptionalism and rugged individualism has come to bite us on the ass in the figure of Donald Trump. That's absurd. And while it's painful, it's also something that we should be able to laugh at in a few years' time, again, if we're not all dead. I think the last thing I want to say, though, is that for those of us who are teachers and educators, there's another kind of storytelling we should be aware of, which is the storytelling of people who are not professionals. In my class on the Vietnam War, I have my students interview survivors of the Vietnam War. They do, we put these online on a website called anotherwarmemorial.com. And as we're discovering, some of the most interesting stories that are out there are not the stories being experienced or told by professional storytellers. These are the stories of everyday workers, who are suffering in various kinds of ways, who are keeping our country alive. Their stories need to be told, and how do we hear them? We have to, as teachers and educators, empower our students and other storytellers to go out there and collect those stories in the absence of a government that would fund such a project, and turn storytelling into a collective act, into a non-elite act, so that we can get some sense of how this disaster is affecting so many average and ordinary people.
I'm so glad you raised that, because one of the things I was so excited about this, and I have to say it's sort of a personal interest. I'm interested in what you would want to share with everybody about how to curate this moment. How do we collect? How do you see what you see and encourage a daily practice of saying to everyone, non-professional storytellers in particular, this is an important moment. Here is how, I go about curating, this moment for myself. And I'm asking partly because, the days are just passing for me, and I'm not, exercising that muscle of recording. So what, as a writer, would you say to the rest of us about, curating this moment for the future? If we're creating a time capsule with a little bit of all of us, what do you direct us to as to how to make this a practice?
Well, I have the same relationship, and for the last couple of months, I've been sort of just wallowing around in this formless, timeless vacuum and absorbing all this horrible news and these terrible stories and so on. And now I started to take notes, because I'm writing a nonfiction book, which began well before this era, but now I think I cannot write this book without taking into account the framing of what's taking place. So I need to take notes. And that's why I brought up the death count. It's an unfortunate kind of thing. I'm sure it disturbs and traumatizes people, but I'm in the business of writing about war and refugees and so on. It's disturbing. And we need to take notes on what's taking place. So we all have the capacity to do that in our different ways. But one of the things that certainly is different about this moment versus, let's say, World War II, is that we have a democratization of media, for better and for worse. We use our cameras to reveal all kinds of horrible things that are happening in American society, from police shooting Black people to other kinds of things that are taking place. Now we have that technology that everyday people can record their stories, and we're starting to see some of that, on Twitter and other kinds of media. And it's been powerful in that sense to get a window into the lives of ordinary Americans who are telling us what they're undergoing. So in the end, everybody's story is universal. Everybody's story is important to themselves and to their families. And everybody should recognize that these stories need to be told. It's not just the people who are professors of writing programs or what novelists or whatever who get to tell these stories. We have to emphasize that everybody's story is unique, and they have the capacity to broadcast that now.
Yes. Kiese, Viet mentioned humor, and I want you to sort of give us a sense. I think for some people, there's a sense that humor is for the future, not for the now. How do you think about that, particularly in the middle of this moment as a writer?
I mean, again, I'm Black and from Mississippi, so humor is the yesterday, the today, and tomorrow. And most of the people who I hang around with, to go back to something Via said, are not writers, and I feel like that is a blessing. And they are the most ingenious storytellers in the world. So I do a lot of listening, I do a lot of recording. But what I'm really trying to concretely think about now, Kim, is like I just work on the assumption that one of the things that I think describes Americans generally is that we're really bad at loving the people we purport to love, right? We're really bad at love. And that can be parents not really loving children the way they should, children not loving parents, partners not loving partners. But also on a micro level, like, the patriots who love America are some of the most hateful Americans in the world. And so like what I'm thinking about is like structurally, because I think we have to talk about heterotopies and utopias, like how do we/I love differently if, for example, there were a healthy jobs mandate, right? Meaning every worker in this country was guaranteed an amazing wage, amazing healthcare, and the amazing ability to leave that job and exit into another healthy job if they wanted to. People talk about that maybe people might say that's the work of like cartoons, but I'm interested in like what that does, not just to like the money, the economy, our literal health, but what does it do to the health of our relationships? How do we treat the people who we purport to love better or worse if these structural changes happen? And what I'm scared of is like maybe the individual changes have to happen before the revolutions necessary to make these structural changes do happen. Conversely, because I'm from Mississippi, I'm also wondering what happens if these white supremacist regionalists actually stopped being white supremacist regionalists and actually started being regionalists. Like, because to be a real regionalist, if you're from the Deep South, necessitates that you value, right, the Black folk, and mostly like the Black women who made like this region possible. And so like, and if you extend that, like what would an Americanism, a patriotism look like if it really loved like the labor and valued the labor of folks who have made the economy move and grow and all that shit for all of these years? So I'm interested in those big questions, but I'm much more interested in like how those big questions impact the way we touch each other, the way we make love, the way we do not make love, the way we sleep, what we eat, how we feel. And I have to write fiction and nonfiction because those are like the questions that I care the most about. And when I talk to my people who are not writers, that imaginative exercise is something they're really interested in exploring. And then I just have to try to channel some of what we come up with. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? So I just don't want to lose the macro for the individual and individual for the relationship, because at the end of the day, I kind of and stupidly think that's what is the most important thing in the world.
How does your fiction and nonfiction selves talk to each other? Do they? Is there actually a dialogue that happens, or do you just have stuff and you go, okay, you take that one case a fiction writer, you take that one case a essay writer, tweeter, right. Facebook poster. Right. How do they talk to each other?
I mean, the fiction part of my body and brain is just always interested in what if, and that's sort of what I was just talking about just there. And because fiction takes so long to create and audiences are so far away, I can't use audience perceptions really to dictate how I move. But the nonfiction writer in me is much more interested in like, how can I be better tomorrow? And how can I present this art to somebody who might read it tomorrow, might read it in a few months? And it's just like being a student again. How can I ignorantly posit some like theory based in like my life that I think happened, and then have it come back to me? So one of them is about what if, and then nonfiction is about how can I and we get better, And I think the nonfiction and the fiction mingle and shit like that, but at the core, the what if is the fiction. The how can we get better is how can I selfishly get better is really what I'm doing in my nonfiction.
Mm-hmm. And Arundhati, we have a few minutes before I ask everybody for, homework. But at this point, I'm interested. You too have, fairly distinct careers as fiction and nonfiction, but all linked in narrativizing, injustices. Do those two parts of your voices dialogue with one another? How do you think differently when you are writing in one genre as opposed to another?
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing to Casey when he was talking about the labor of people that created America, and how to be a true patriot, you'd have to love those people who labored and who made it, not just to be a white regionalist, but to be someone who learns to love. I mean, just from the perspective of a non-American, so much of the world has been devastated to make America. After 9/11, how many countries have been destroyed? The wars of capitalism have devastated population after population. So somehow I think we have to get out of patriotism to a much more universal space, where we, like, the world's elite are actually one country, and the others are another country, so it's something which we, and of course a lot of my nonfiction is about those things too, those imperial wars that I fought, the wars of American empire and colonialism and so on. And yeah, my fiction and nonfiction selves are so linked. Like I feel like I'm a sort of sedimentary rock, with my nonfiction is just layers and layers of me, from traveling, walking through river valleys and forests and mountains and guerrilla wars and all of that. And but every time I write nonfiction, it is to try and break a bullying consensus that is being created by the mainstream media at a moment at which it's about to attack, like physically with soldiers and guns, attack vulnerable communities. And that attack is preceded by the demonization of that community, whatever it is, whether it's people protesting a dam or whether it's guerrillas in the forest, whatever. So my nonfiction comes out of a very argumentative, very focused. My body is like in a fury. I can hardly sleep. I just work like that. And my fiction is like, I'm in no hurry. It's a dance. It's like you're trying to create a universe for somebody that you love and walk them through it, to say, this is how it was. Now you're showing Kashmir, which is when I write, one of the reasons I'm always attacked by the right wing, even physically, stages destroyed, people come and shout outside my house, is because of my writing on Kashmir. And while you're asking about this COVID moment and how does one go out and grasp it? As we are speaking, Kimberly, I have to tell you that I have almost every friend of mine who I have worked with over the years is in jail. Is in jail, serving life sentences, being called terrorists under the Unlawful Activities Act. We talk about refugees in the world. In India, an anti-Muslim citizenship law is making refugees out of citizens. The protests that happened just before this COVID crisis hit, the state hasn't stopped doing anything. It's arresting students, picking them up, putting them in jail. There's such a fear of every word you write, every comma you put. Where is it? What's going to happen? Who's going to do what to whom? The danger is so imminent. And just as in the US, here too, the jails are full of people who are now getting infected, and friends, and some of them are not even young people. 80 years old, one person, a poet, in jail, where this disease is just so rampant. So it's such a dangerous moment, where the state is moving so fast to shut down everything, so that when things open up, the protests that had millions of people on the march don't start up again. So everyone who's been thought of as a local leader, someone is being put into jail.
Thank you, Arundhati. We're moving to our conclusion, and thank you, Arundhati, for those concluding comments. I want to just circle back one more time to Kiese and Viet to ask you to give us some concluding thought. Here's the thing that I had queued up to ask. As a lawyer, someone asked me, well, okay, so what's your use value? What do you bring to a pandemic? What do you bring to, the potential life-changing moment in recent human history? I would say, well, what I think I bring to it is, sort of the false necessity of the existing structures for sorting out how we move forward. So I want to offer up how the platforms that we think are just there are constructed, and they don't have to be constructed. That's what the lawyer brings to the pandemic. What does the writer bring to the pandemic? And so I'll start with you, Kiese.
I mean, this could start the conversation all over again, but I think what I need to be aware of, and hopefully all of us need to be aware of, is that what the writer can bring is much more terror. And I think that we often think about writing as like this panacea, or talk about writers and imbue them with some certain kind of like innocence or glow. But I think one of the reasons we are in the place we are now, not just in this nation or in this region or in this world, is because of the failure of writers. So writers can bring terror, and I think it's part of our jobs to not bring terror. And I also want to say it's hard because I think, one of the things that I think we have to do within an empire is that, like, I know lots of people who are much more readily interested in deconstructing like American empire than they are de-investing themselves from anti-Black racism. And so we are all potential terrorists as writers. And I just think we need to hold that to heart. That would be what I think.
Thank you, Kiese. Viet.
Well, as a college student, I was both an activist and a wannabe writer, and being an activist never made me feel guilty. Being a writer, or wannabe writer, made me feel guilty. Like, maybe I wasn't doing enough. Like, how do I enact real change in this world? I need to actually go out there, join an organization, engage in movement politics and these kinds of things. And I think those are absolutely really necessary. But I've learned how to, I'm learning how not to feel guilty as a writer, because writers are really crucial to change, to movements, to politics, because one of the things that we can do is imagine new worlds, imagine relationships with other people, both at an emotional level, but also in a political level as well. And so we still need our storytellers to tell us the stories of who we are, where we've been, where we can go. And the other thing about storytellers that I think are really crucial is that the good storytellers are the ones who look within themselves. They make us feel things because they can feel things. They make us feel our vulnerability and our hurt and our pain because they go inside themselves to feel those kinds of things. That's a hard thing to do. It's taken me decades to be able to get to the point where I can try to be vulnerable with myself, so that I can be vulnerable in my writing, so that I can connect with other people. And that is both a personal challenge for the writer, but it's also one that we enact collectively as a society. I mean, many of the problems that we have as a society are due to the fact that many people don't want to look at the vulnerability and the pain and the hurt that are constitutive of American life, right? And so writers do that function for us. And I think it's a very important reason why many people don't want to be writers, because it's a hard thing to do, not just the art of writing, but the task of looking within yourself. And if anything, those of us, we're undergoing a period of isolation, we are left alone with ourselves. It's terrifying for so many people. Besides the physical and economic limitations, the psychological problem of being alone with yourself is terrifying. But writers deal with that every day. And so, we, for better or worse, can be a model for how to try to cope with that experience.
Yes. And the three of you are certainly a model for me. I couldn't thank you enough for this amazing conversation. And I want to thank all our listeners for joining us as well. Of course, this wouldn't have been possible without the time and the hard work of our team at the African American Policy Forum and the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies. And of course, a very, very special thank you to our panelists, Viet Thanh Nguyen, Arundhati Roy, and Kiese Layman. This has been an inspiring conversation, a tough conversation, and a lifting conversation. And I hope that all of you listening can keep these kind of conversations going with your friends, families, and within your communities. You can follow AA Policy Forum across social media, or me on Twitter at Sandy Locks, or Instagram, Kimberly Crenshaw. We'll be posting more information about this conversation on our website, aapf.org, and we'll continue to provide resources and opportunities to galvanize our collective experience into an energy that can propel us to another universe of possibility. We'll do so by posting a recording of this event on YouTube, a summary on our website's blog, and then next week we'll release this event as an episode on Intersectionality Matters. You can find that on iTunes, Spotify, and SoundCloud. And we'll be posting an edited version of the conversation in the coming week. After today, we're gonna be taking a pause on our Wednesday editions of Under the Blacklight. We'll be back, and when we do, we'll turn our gaze more fully to the international dimensions of the crisis. So keep an eye out for us on social media, our newsletters, and look to our website for updates. Now, we're excited to welcome some of our listeners, Anna Nguyen, Annie Tan, Matthew Reynolds, Amy Hu, Christine Pei, and Grace Cowell to a post-show talk with myself, some friends, and maybe some of today's panelists. Thank you all for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your evening, morning, afternoon, and day. Please stay safe, stay strong as we continue to organize and resist.